time and time and time again, very poor decisions are made at the very top of the system. He's not really criticizing the fighting generals at the front line. He's criticizing the high command back in Moscow. And precisely his view is that they never, ever acknowledge the mistakes they made. Everything is a grand triumph, or else it was an unavoidable mishap. There's never any awareness of that. And that's what he's really getting at. And that is a dangerous line for the Kremlin, because it fits in with the perspectives of a lot of others, including those generals at the front line, who are trying their best to sort of tactically innovate. And they are responding and adapting to the war depressingly well. But they're doing so in the context of a high command that just clearly is just not willing to think again about how it fights the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with Professor Mark Galeotti. Mark is a former advisor to the Foreign Office on Russian foreign and security policy. He's the author of several books, including Downfall, and hosts a regular podcast, In Moscow's Shadows. Mark, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you again.
Good to be here again.
Can I just start by the news this week that the French authorities boarded an oil tanker, the Boracay near Saint-Nazaire, suspected of being part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. What can you tell us about the vessel? What is the suspicion about it?
Well, look, we've known that the shadow fleet, so-called, has been used for shipping Russian oil out. In this particular case, there is a particular suspicion that the ship was also used as a base for drones. There's been something of an epidemic of drones buzzing various European airports, new power facilities, military bases, and the like. So in some ways, I think this was more than anything else a shot across the bows for Russia. The French deciding that they were going to go there. They have sort of, at the moment, seized the ship, really more under kind of procedural grounds in terms of not clearly stating its flag registry and that kind of thing. But clearly they are looking for evidence that it was indeed being used as a drone platform, because that is a potentially new wrinkle to this whole hybrid war, call it what you will, that Russia is waging. So we're still waiting to see what comes of that. But as I said, more than anything else, I think this is an attempt by the French to signal to the Russians, we know what you're doing, we're onto you, and if need be, we can escalate.
And I'm going to ask you a little bit more later on about those incursions. But what do we know about the growth of Russia's shadow fleet operations since 2022?
Well, look, there's always a danger. I mean, the shadow fleet, whoever came up with the shadow fleet, it's a great term, but it makes it sound a lot more exciting than it really is. It's not like there is some kind of stealthy fleet of ships. On the whole, more than anything else, this is just simply a reflection of the market. There's been this attempt to strangle Russian oil sales to the rest of the world. And the problem is that there is still a huge and extensive market for cheap Russian oil. And a lot of countries that, frankly, don't necessarily want to challenge the West and find themselves being caught under secondary sanctions. But on the other hand, resent those sanctions. They more or less regard this, and this is a term that I've had expressed to me by diplomats from Africa, for example. They called that economic imperialism by the West. Basically, we don't want you to trade with these people and we will punish you if you do. And therefore, what's emerged, and to a large extent it's the Russians facilitating, but it's also because other companies and countries have got in on the act, is a whole series of ships which aren't registered to perhaps the most reputable countries. Their insurance status is often distinctly dubious, which is a real environmental worry if something goes wrong with one of these often rather sort of rusty and creaky ships. But nonetheless, plying that trade between Russian ports and various markets. And the trouble is that every time some new sanctions regime is announced, it's going to plug the loopholes and strike down more of these ships and such like, more of them emerge. And it's not that I'm saying, therefore, the sanctions are useless, not at all. It's just that we have to realize it is a sort of a whack-a-mole process whereby, so long as there is a demand, ships will emerge that can try and meet that demand.
So let's just talk about your latest episode of your podcast. And in it, you examine the way Putin finds himself locked into the war in Ukraine, sanctioned and facing recessions. It's not what he planned.
It's not. And one of the sort of central themes of that particular episode is I was kind of trying to explore a different way of thinking about Putin. We have a tendency to focus on what Putin wants and Putin's actual and alleged successes. And look, there are successes, of course. But on the other hand, I think we have to appreciate the degree to which really we have come to where we are today through a series of blunders. Not all, but most or many by Putin himself. And we can track this back to 2013, 2014, when he totally misread the mood in Ukraine. He saw what was happening of Ukraine's increasing integration with the European Union, or desire for integration, as some kind of EU land grab that was being foisted on the Ukrainians. He didn't understand the strength of feeling. He basically bullied the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych into doing a 180-degree turn and refusing to sign this deal with the European Union, which triggered the whole revolution of dignity, which swept Yanukovych from power. Then Putin took Crimea, which admittedly was actually a textbook operation. And if he probably stopped there, I suspect he would have got away with it. Ukraine really wouldn't have been able to do much about it. The West would have wagged stern fingers and maybe imposed a few sanctions, but that's about it. But he was tempted to go further into the Donbass, which in some ways led to the slide to the current war. And even after all that, in February 2022, he clearly was still convinced that Ukraine wasn't a real country, that the Ukrainians were not really going to fight for their sovereignty, and that he could just roll in and impose some kind of puppet leader. So, all of this is actually about Putin not understanding the world around him, particularly not understanding Ukraine, not really understanding the realities of military power and the limitations, not understanding that he really needed to take counsel with his own generals before engaging in it. And therefore, look, it's not in any way to excuse, of course, but if we're trying to work out the sorts of things that Putin is likely to do in the future, in some ways we ought to focus on his blind spots, on the mistakes that he characteristically makes, rather than this idea that he's still some kind of grand master of three-dimensional geopolitical chess.
And that is really quite disturbing if you look at it from that angle, that it's through a lack of understanding rather than a strategy.
Yes and no. In some ways, for me, one of the greatest concerns would have been, what if Putin had been smarter? Yes, on one level, maybe things would have been more predictable, but they probably would also have been rather worse. I mean, if, for example, he had essentially tasked his generals with coming up with a war plan to invade Ukraine. I'm not saying that they necessarily would have won, but let's not forget that the very same military experts, particularly ones privy to intelligence before the war, who were saying absolutely Russia is going to invade, were also saying that basically within a matter of days or weeks, Russia would have won. So things could have actually been a lot nastier, and in some ways, ironically, Putin has turned out to be Ukraine's secret weapon, given the number of mistakes he's made.
And it's really interesting because you were kind of spurred on to talk about this in the podcast by this communication released from behind bars in Russia by Igor Girkin, pointing to mistakes and complaining that they're not being owned up to, and instead they're being rewarded. Can you just start by reminding us who he is exactly and why he's in prison?
Yes, I mean, Igor Girkin, who generally goes by his old sort of military call sign, Strelkov, and it says something when your call sign is shooter or gunman, basically. He, by his own admission, he calls himself the man who pulled the trigger on the Donbass war. He's an ultra-nationalist figure, a reenactor. He likes to play in sort of cosplay almost the role of, amongst other things, a Tsarist-era White Guard officer. And he was an officer within the Federal Security Service's sort of military units. He was involved in a whole variety of deniable operations, including the seizure of Crimea. And then he, almost certainly without actual authorization, led a group of about 30 volunteers, ultranationalists, and so forth into the Ukrainian Donbass region in 2014. He switched his phone off so no one could try and kind of call him back. And by taking the center in the town of Slavyansk, essentially really sort of triggered the whole new stage in the kind of messy mix of foreign incursion and civil war that was taking place in the Donbass. So this is a man who then became very briefly the Minister of Defense of the self-proclaimed People's Republics there. not someone who is in any way a liberal, a West looker, a bleeding heart figure. Quite the opposite. In fact, although he hasn't been sort of formally arraigned and tried, I think we could consider him a war criminal. But although he was then yanked out of the Donbass when he became too critical of Moscow, nonetheless, he clearly had a certain sort of status as a kind of approved critic. He was allowed still to complain about the war, to criticize Putin from a nationalist perspective, in part, I think, as a safety valve. I mean, certainly talking to people who were connected to the security apparatus in Russia, there was a sense that the Kremlin was just a bit worried about what would happen if they went after him, because he did speak for a small minority within Russia, but a small minority that's disproportionately represented in the military and the security forces. Then, of course, after Prigozhin's mutiny back in 2023, suddenly everything became a lot more problematic. 2024. And Girkin was arrested and sent to prison simply because suddenly the Kremlin got very worried about the nationalists. But even so, from prison, he still is able to sort of get his word out. And he has been a real, ironically, actually quite sharp and accurate critic of Kremlin policy from the nationalist side.
And it's quite an achievement that he's actually getting his voice out, isn't it, I suppose, from behind bars. He's highly critical then of how the war has been prosecuted, and says instead of recognising mistakes, as I said, that the commanders are being decorated for them. What are the mistakes he's actually pointing out?
A lot of it is very, very sort of tactical and technical, relating to individual engagements. His main issue is, he's very, very critical about the entire high command. Back when the former defense minister Shoigu was still in position, he called him the plywood marshal. He's exceedingly critical of still the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov. And indeed, the one thing that is taboo for most people, he's also critical of Putin, whom he ironically calls our unique strategic advantage. And his view is yes, that on the one hand, Russia hasn't really fought this war properly, and it hasn't really treated it seriously enough. He would want to see a further mobilization, another 100, 200, 300,000 troops being thrown into the war. Basically, if you want to win it, that's what it's going to take, is his view. But the main thing is precisely his sense that time and time and time again, very poor decisions are made at the very top of the system. He's not really criticizing the fighting generals at the front line. He's criticizing the high command back in Moscow. And precisely his view is that they never, ever acknowledge the mistakes they've made. Everything is a grand triumph, or else it was an unavoidable mishap. There's never any awareness of that. And that's what he's really getting at. And that is a dangerous line for the Kremlin, because it fits in with the perspectives of a lot of others, including those generals at the front line, who are trying their best to sort of tactically innovate. And they are responding and adapting to the war depressingly well. But they're doing so in the context of a high command that just clearly is just not willing to think again about how it fights the war, and indeed whether it fights the war. Girkin's point was, if we're not going to try and win this war, then frankly, we should end this war.
And is anyone listening to him?
Yes. People are listening to him in the sense of, I'm not talking about Putin and Gerasimov, because there's certainly no signs that they're changing their ways. But within Russia, absolutely. Look, unlike, for example, many of the sort of liberal critics who ended up going into exile, much of whose output in terms of social media posts and the like was with an eye to the West, Strankov is not talking to us. He is talking to his constituency within Russia. In other words, the hawks, the nationalists, the people who are just fed up with the way this war is being fought. They didn't have a problem with invading Ukraine. They had a problem with the fact that it's being done so damn badly. And the striking thing is that his social media presence is not only still there, it gets retweeted and reposted and discussed a lot, and phrases and expressions of his do crop up in other people's work. So, he clearly is influential. As I said, I think we need to stress that he's speaking for a narrow constituency, but it's a constituency, to put it bluntly, with guns.
So at the moment, your assessment would be that what he's saying, his criticism, is not likely to build into any serious challenge in a Prigozhin kind of way, but that it's just something to watch.
I think it's something to watch because precisely he is articulating the views of many others. And look, exactly, these are not people who are about to turn their guns on Moscow. But as we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny, when actually the overwhelming majority of the security forces neither joined the mutiny nor did they do anything to try and stop it, but essentially decided they'd just sit back and see what happens. I think what the views of people like Strelkov, why they're worth listening to, are precisely because these are the kind of people who, even if they're not going to be in a position to try and sort of topple Putin or change policy, they are getting sufficiently fed up that if and as and when there is some kind of black swan crisis, systemic crisis that really challenges the regime, they may well not be willing to come out and help it.
Can I just talk about something else that we started off at the beginning about these recent incursions, and just interested to get your perspective on it, because the message that you've been bringing out is that part of Putin's problem is that he's never very decisive, and that sometimes when there are big decisions to make, he may equivocate. And I'm just wondering what you think about the way these conducted, from a Russian Kremlin kind of objective point of view, the way they've been conducted into NATO airspace by the drones and the fighter jets, because you seem to be suggesting that this actually may end up being a mistake that actually hands a gift to NATO.
Yes, I mean, I think we have to realise that what's going on is not some kind of prelude to an attack or whatever. It's carefully calibrated. And, we don't necessarily know in each particular instance what the intent was and so forth. But nonetheless, none of these have been designed to be instantly inflammatory to the degree where NATO would feel it has to respond actively. If one looks at the drones that went into Polish airspace, for example, they were not armed attack drones. They were essentially they were some decoy drones. The aircraft that cut their way through Estonian airspace, I mean, they were basically heading to a Russian base in Kaliningrad. The actual handling of the intercept by Italian F-35s was apparently handled in a fairly professional way. There were none of the sort of attempts to do little sort of macho stunts to try and sort of basically intimidate the NATO planes or anything like that. But clearly there is this sudden, quite dramatic escalation in these kind of, non-directly threatening but deeply inconvenient operations. And look, I think that this is likely to be really an element of coercive signalling, because after all, we are at the crucial moment in which the Europeans, particularly within the coalition of the willing, are finalising quite what security guarantees they're going to be willing to give Ukraine. And at the moment, they're also trying to persuade America to be as reliable as possible as a backstop. And this is the problem with America. Unfortunately, what they say they're going to do today, they may well not do or say tomorrow. And I think this is a point where essentially Putin is trying to warn off the Europeans from being too interventionist, more or less saying, look, do you really want to have skin in the game? He's already said, for example, that Western troops in Ukraine would be considered legitimate military targets. Now, Putin has a tendency to issue threats from nuclear ones downwards. One can't always regard them as absolute reality. But I think at the moment, we are seeing a Russian campaign to try and basically make Europe feel sensitive, worried, and alone, and therefore that they will water down the security guarantees that they offer Ukraine. And I think that's really the political context. But in terms of that last point about how NATO may well gain, and I'm sorry I'm rambling on here, but I'm an academic, what do you expect? I think the point is this, and we're beginning to actually see, again, in very cautious coded forms, this also appearing in some Russian discourse, is, as I say, in each of these attacks, it may attacks, call them what you will, closing down an airport for a while or whatever. I mean, I was stuck for an hour and a half in Berlin because of sort of some of these shenanigans. In and of themselves, they are no big deal. They are meant to be politically demonstrative more than anything else. However, in the process, they are giving us something of a masterclass in how the Russians could indeed mess with us, how disruptive that could be, and therefore what we need to do about it. Because after all, if there was, God forbid, any kind of direct military confrontation with NATO, we can expect precisely these kind of, there's so many jargon terms, hybrid war, grey zone warfare, call them what you will. But anyway, these kind of attempts to disrupt us, particularly before the actual shooting starts. Well, now we're getting a chance to get our act together beforehand. We have proven to be really bad at predicting threats in advance, quite frankly. But now, with all this talk of a drone wall, we do have a sense of our vulnerability, and we have a chance to do something about it.
And to that point, it's really interesting the kind of rhetoric that's being talked about on Poland after the drone incursions now, 3 weeks on. It's alleged that the Kremlin is preparing a sabotage operation there. President Zelensky is talking about that very openly. What are the signs of that?
Yeah, to be brutally honest, none whatsoever. I think this is all part of the fact that we have to realise that there is actually a three-cornered sort of political campaign here. There is the West, there is Moscow, and there is Kyiv, which has its own interests and clearly wants to keep Europe engaged and, to put it very bluntly, worried. So, yes, we've had these claims from Kyiv that the Russians are planning to send basically special forces or intelligence officers into Poland to carry out sabotage operations. Whereas what Moscow is claiming is that the Ukrainians and the Poles together are planning to stage a kind of a mock attack using Russians who have defected and joined the Ukrainian forces. And they're going to use that as a pretext as to therefore why NATO should be stiffening its position. Now, what is the reality? Obviously, I don't know. However, it is fair to say that up to now, the Russians have carried out sabotage operations in the West, including in Poland, but they've done so with proxies. Because frankly, it's quite easy and depressingly cheap to be able to hire some local thugs to burn something down, as we discovered with the attacks on the warehouses in northeast London. Those were not highly trained Russian special forces that were going in. Those are just local thugs who saw an opportunity to earn some money that they thought would be a fairly easy thing. So I think the idea that the Russians would actually be sending special forces across the very, very heavily fortified and monitored Polish border does sound a little bit iffy to me. But, ultimately, who knows?
It's interesting that you talk about these three-pronged different interests in talking up what may or may not be happening. I just, on the subject of Moldova, though, in the presidential elections, there was a huge amount of publicity and statements made about Russian interference ahead of those, or alleged Russian interference ahead of those elections. And it did go more towards the EU way and not towards the Kremlin and towards Russia. Do you think that actually, as you were saying, that being more aware and being more prepared to call things out before they happen actually had an effect there and actually stalled whatever the Kremlin may or may not have been plotting?
I mean, look, I can, because I don't really count and matter, I can actually be a little bit more bullish. I'm sure that Moscow was indeed trying to meddle in the Moldovan election. And yes, I think the fact that it was called out was in many ways a positive thing. I mean, we also have to register that there were some slightly worrying signs also from Moldova, in the sense that, we had two parties that were essentially disqualified just a couple of days before the election, to anti-government, pro-Moscow parties, with not enough time for them to appeal and so forth. And there were some other sort of slightly worrying signs about the degree to which some, I wouldn't say anti-democratic, but slightly questionable practices were used. But nonetheless, clearly it's because the Moldovan government regards itself in an existential position, in that, it is essentially under considerable pressure. There's talk that the Russians may have put $400 million into this campaign to try to destabilize Moldova. And Moldova is, after all, an incredibly poor and small country. Therefore, this was a serious threat. But precisely, in some ways, what we get is time and time again, Putin uses assets and strategies for, frankly, quite questionable purposes. I mean, Moldova, even if a pro-Russian government had come in power in Moldova, which was never really the likelihood, but even then, well, what would Putin do with that? It's not even as though actually his forces can reach Moldova without having to go through other countries' airspace. So, I think sort of for questionable purposes, Putin just gets carried away, or, is encouraged by people around him to get carried away by a particular task. throws resources into it that he then loses. I mean, that's $400 million that he's not going to see again. And also gives us a better sense as to what he can do so that we can begin to target-proof ourselves, harden ourselves against future attacks. And this is what I mean about Putin not being very smart in many ways. He has his talents, we have to acknowledge that, but I think geopolitically he's clearly quite limited. And time again, he fritters away assets that really needed to be used in a much more strategic way.
And how well do you think he's dealing with the problems back home in terms of the fuel shortages that are being caused by Ukraine's ability to now sustain and repeat long-range attacks on Russian oil refineries?
I think it's fair to say that throughout his career, it seems, Putin has had something of the luck of the devil. And at the moment, his real luck is precisely that he has a lot of very, very sharp technocratic managers of his system, in the government, in the central bank and elsewhere. Now, this particular problem with the very effective long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russian petrol refineries and distribution venues and so forth, of which there are just too many, too widely spread for the Russians to be able to protect, is causing a real problem, because it's a problem that actually affects ordinary Russians. And there's nothing really much that the state can do to featherbed them. It's tried claiming that the real problem is just seasonal maintenance and so forth. No one really buys that. How well is Putin coping with that? Well, look, ultimately he is the autocrat of an authoritarian regime. I mean, this is not a democracy in any way. He can ride out a lot of pressure up to the point when you actually get people on the streets, and we're nowhere near that. But it does emphasize to me why actually Putin's gamble that he can outlast Ukraine is perhaps understandable when you look at the size of the respective economies and populations and so forth, but increasingly carries with it risks. Risks that, a gathering together of a variety of different issues. We already, inflation is unlikely to go below about 7%, despite the fact that the target is 4%. Although pensions and minimum wage are being increased, a lot of people's salaries are now beginning to be squeezed after a couple of years in which they did quite well. Now there's trouble with petrol, and that just doesn't affect just filling up your family car. That also affects the trucking industry and so forth. It increases prices for things like food and also creates sort of shortages. So, bit by bit, all these things come together. And although I think until relatively recently, Putin was trying to sort of hand wave that away, increasingly now, he is clearly looking at economic issues. I don't think he truly understands the nature of the issue, perhaps because people don't really want to tell him how bad things could get. But nonetheless, there is that growing sense that the clock, it may be ticking for Ukraine, but it's also ticking for Russia.
So that gamble that he can outlast Ukraine, it may well prove to be wrong.
It may well. Again, so much depends on how far the Ukrainians can continue to find manpower, because that is their sort of crucial issue, and also whether or not they can fund their state, which is why we're having so much interest in this issue of trying to seize Russian sovereign assets that are currently frozen in the West, because at the moment, there are real questions about the long-term liquidity of the Ukrainian government. But against that, the Russian situation is more unpredictable, and we have to acknowledge that Russia does not look as if it's heading for a sort of imminent collapse or anything like that. But nonetheless, the easy assumptions that maybe were dominant this spring, in which in some ways Putin batted away the option of trying to work with Trump to reach some kind of a deal. And essentially he did string Trump along. Well, I do wonder if he's now regretting that, because, as winter is coming, things are looking a little bit tougher for Russia.
So do you think he's going to be tempted? He's not going to come to the negotiating table, though, is he?
I think that he's willing to accept the thought that there may be some kind of deal that suits him, but that's only if Ukraine is really willing to basically, throw a lot at him in order to sort of try and get him to end the war. He probably still is going to demand that piece of the Donetsk region containing the fortress belt of cities, which I don't think is for a moment that Zelensky can or would surrender. So, I think he still has this fantasy that Ukraine is going to come and more or less capitulate. That's his idea of negotiating. So, he's willing to talk, but on his terms. But a meaningful negotiation in which he actually accepts Ukrainian sovereignty and even just simply freezes the front line as it is now, I don't think he's there yet.
Just on the long-range strikes, that there are reports by the Reuters news agency today that the US is saying they'll provide Ukraine with intelligence on long-range, or two officials have said they'll provide Ukraine with intelligence on long-range energy infrastructure targets inside Russia. They're asking NATO allies to do the same. And there's also still this question as to whether or not President Zelensky will be granted what he's asking for, these long-range Tomahawk missiles, or something similar that could go much deeper into Russia. How worried do you think the Kremlin is about that, especially when you hear the likes of the spokesperson Peskov saying that this would mean US troops being directly at war with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, this is the trouble. Unfortunately, on the one hand, we have to deal with Russian rhetoric that is precisely designed to be a deterrent, to try and talk up potential risks. And on the other hand, we're dealing with an American administration, as I said, that we really don't know where it's going to be tomorrow, let alone next week. So, yes, this issue of intelligence to support long-range targeting is important, though I think to a large extent the Americans are already providing it. The Tomahawk missiles, it's a trickier one because, frankly, they are a high-value asset. A lot of other people want to buy them. And also America itself is looking to replenish its stocks of Tomahawks. So I can't help but wonder if this is one of these things which is going to be promised, but maybe when you actually look at the fine print, they wouldn't appear until 2027 or something like that. But again, this is the point. With Trump, he could decide tomorrow that he's going to send some Tomahawk launchers and missiles to Ukraine. Or he could decide tomorrow that he doesn't want to get involved. The bottom line is his position at the moment is that although he's increasingly fulsome about Ukraine and its chances of taking back territory and so forth, he has basically walked away from this war. He's not willing to provide aid in any practical sense. He's willing to let the Europeans buy weapons from America to give to Ukraine. So in some ways, I think this is him saying, I wasn't able to get this quick and easy win that I thought, therefore I'm not going to play.
And is that why you think at the moment that Kyiv has an interest in portraying the conflict as larger and more dangerous to Europe? And also, on the other hand, Putin also has his own motivations for portraying the NATO as a threat to Russia.
Yes, I mean, look, from Kyiv's point of view, I'm putting words in their mouth here, but my suspicion is they don't really trust us in Europe. And that's not because they think that we're secretly in cahoots with Russia or China or anything like that. It's that they are aware of the degree to which Western societies are buffeted by all kinds of other pressures, and particularly our political leaders. They find themselves hostage to the opinion polls and the electoral cycle and such like. So there is that sense of that almost Zelensky's job is to keep Europe engaged, just as we're desperately trying to keep America engaged. The Ukrainians are desperately trying to keep us in Europe engaged, not least because what's going to come is going to be very expensive. If they're going to be buying weapons from America to arm Ukraine, if they're going to be providing new resources to keep the Ukrainian government financially afloat, that all comes at a cost. So this is a time in which actually I don't think there are any Western politicians who are saying, oh, I have a few spare billion euros, pounds, or whatever that I just don't know what to do with. I mean, there is that sense that at a time when there's money for healthcare, money for national defence, after all, we're also meant to be spending money on building up our own armed forces. The constant fear in Ukraine is that for all our warm words, we will essentially start trying to scale down our commitments. So that's why they have to keep us worried. And I'm not blaming them for it. I mean, it's a very necessary task. And that's why they actually have to present this as a war that in some ways they are fighting on our behalf. But just to go back to the Russia point, yeah, I mean, there is an interesting calibration here. The very time when Western politicians are talking much more openly about war, a war of sorts, a hybrid war, call it what you will, but a war nonetheless, which is a tricky word to use because essentially it is about an armed conflict between states, not drones buzzing airports. At the same time, you have the Russians trying desperately to calibrate, being threatening towards us, but not quite so threatening that they alienate their own population. Because part of the way that Putin has been able to keep the Russian population quiet about all of this, even though there is increasing signs of disquiet, is essentially by making it optional for them. The war is being fought by volunteers, generally from impoverished regions, offered life-altering sums of money to go and fight. If you are a well-off Muscovite, you probably don't know anyone who's fighting in the war. You probably don't even feel that there's a war going on. So the worry is that if ordinary Russians start to think, oh my gosh, this could spiral out of control, that would be politically dangerous. So Putin and his propagandists are playing this delicate game of trying to scare the West, but not scare their own population.
It's going to be very interesting to watch, and obviously horrific that it continues, the war. But Mark, it's always good to have your insight. Thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.